All right. Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
It's time for us to get started. We are in Matthew 24 this evening. And we're now entering in earnest into the final and probably most difficult discourse of Matthew's gospel. Matthew has arranged his gospel around 5 discourses of Jesus, and this is the 5th one. And I say that we're entering into it in earnest because we should see Matthew 23 as the introduction to this discourse. So the woes against the scribes and the Pharisees really leads us into this. In fact, this discourse starts with Jesus leaving the temple immediately after this controversy that he has had with them inside the temple. And the first half of this discourse, chapter 24, is really only going to make sense to us in light of those woes and condemnations. In fact, we're going to see Jesus using some of the same language in Matthew 24 that he used in condemning the scribes and the Pharisees and Jerusalem in Matthew 23. And again, that will help give us some sense of what Jesus is talking about in Matthew 24. This is why, if you were here way back at the beginning of this class, the outline that I gave for the Gospel of Matthew has the discourse starting in chapter 23. All right, so this discourse is traditionally known as the Olivet Discourse, because in chapter 24, verse 3, we read, "As he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him and asked him some questions, and then we're off to the races." And we're not going to make much of this, but we can appreciate, I suppose, the artfulness in how Jesus' ministry opens and closes with 2 discourses on the mountain. All right, the Sermon on the Mount, he goes up on the mountain and he's teaching the crowds. This final discourse, he goes up on the Mount of Olives and he's teaching his disciples. And this is going to be the last thing that he does before his betrayal, his arrest, his crucifixion, and his resurrection. But the main thing that we want to focus on here, before we get into the reading itself, is the difficulty that people tend to have with this discourse. It is a discourse about judgment, and the question always comes down to what judgment is he talking about? Is this a description of the judgment against Israel and the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple in AD 70? Or is this a description of the final judgment, the second coming, the general resurrection? Or is it a description of both? And if it is a description of both, well, then what's the relationship between those 2 judgments? And that's why this text has become, honestly, a seedbed for division and error. Not that the text teaches or encourages error, but that people abuse this text or misunderstand this text, and as a result of that, end up in all kinds of error. I want us to just briefly list out a few of the more popular ones. And over the course of this study, chapters 24, especially chapter 24, and also chapter 25, we will, I think, more and more thoroughly understand what's erroneous about those views and what the correct view is. So if I step on any toes tonight, well, they might not feel better until a later class. But there are many, particularly in evangelical and charismatic circles, who think that all of this discourse pertains to the final judgment. That the whole thing, from chapter 24 down to the end of chapter 25, is all about the final judgment. And when we read chapter 24, we're going to see that Jesus lays out some signs, things that the disciples are supposed to be looking for leading up to this judgment that he's talking about in chapter 24. And so if we think that the whole thing is about the final judgment, well then now all of a sudden Matthew 24 becomes our key to figuring out when the final judgment is about to happen. Because after all, Jesus talks about the sign of his coming. And so these are the sorts of people who take every big event in the news as a sign that we are in the last days. Right? We know people like that, right? That, there's war in Israel, we must be in the last days. Right? The president is some guy that we really don't like, we must be in the last days. The president is some guy that we really do like, that's also the last days. Like every major event, they go, here's another sign. And people have been going on like this for decades, centuries even. And it's all right, how many imminent signs can we pile up before we finally decide, well, wait a minute, maybe these weren't actually signs of the imminent return of Jesus. And that's all aside from the fact that it's a misunderstanding of the New Testament idea of the last days. That's a whole other subject. Related to this is the premillennial idea of the rapture, which is taken from chapter 24, verses 40 and 41. Then 2 men will be in the field, one will be taken and one left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken and one left. And the rapture is a way of fitting these verses into the idea that this is all about the final judgment, or the second coming of Christ. The second coming at the outset of the millennium, according to the premillennial idea. Another related error is the postmillennial idea that the second coming and the final judgment will only occur when every nation on earth is Christianized and the majority of humanity is converted to the faith, or even all of humanity is converted to the faith. And this is something that they pick up from chapter 24, verse 14. And this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. And notice, by the way, that you have 2 different camps that are on opposite sides of the millennium using the same chapter to bolster their understanding of the final judgment and the last days. Premillennialists believing that the second coming will happen at the beginning of the millennium, postmillennialists believing that it will happen after the millennium. All right, so in this, if you've got any friends that are this way, whether we're talking pre-mill, post-mill, anyone who looks at this whole thing as pertaining to the final judgment, it's my hope that this study of this discourse will equip us to understand this better and to be able to share the truth with our friends that believe in that way. So that's one popular error. Like the whole thing is about the last judgment. Another popular error runs in completely the opposite direction. Instead of seeing the entire discourse as having to do with the final judgment, they see the whole discourse as only having to do with the destruction of Jerusalem. And we refer to various forms of this error as preterism, or more commonly in our circles, we refer to this as the AD 70 doctrine. I don't know if you've heard of that before. In its most extreme form, it claims that all biblical prophecy was fulfilled in AD 70 at the destruction of the temple. That you cannot, there's different preterisms, by the way. Partial preterism just sees it as being the vast majority of biblical prophecy is fulfilled then. Full preterism teaches that you cannot find any unfulfilled prophecy in the Bible. Go to any place in the Bible. Any place, whether we're talking Daniel, we're talking Revelation, we're talking Matthew here, we're talking 1st or 2nd Thessalonians, you will not find a prophecy anywhere that has not already been fulfilled and is in our past. And they mean this totally. Like, the second coming, it's already happened, according to full preterists. The resurrection, that's already happened too. The last judgment has also already happened, according to this view, right? Don't believe your lying eyes as you look around and it seems like, well, wait a minute, this surely can't be it. Well, no, according to preterism, this is it. You are already living in a reality that is as good as it will ever get. So much for the hope of the resurrection, I suppose. In fact, in this view, Jesus has defeated death as fully as he ever will, albeit metaphorically, because people still die all the time. But it's a fairly popular error. The final common error that we're going to consider this evening that springs from this discourse is a Christological error. All right, and we're laying all this groundwork, just to understand how important this discourse is and how important it is to read this right. But the final common error we're going to look at is a Christological error, and that is an error about Jesus, an error about who Christ is. There are many who believe that Jesus himself, in this discourse, is conflating the judgment against Jerusalem with his second coming. That Jesus himself understood them to be one and the same judgment. That the second coming, the general resurrection, the final judgment, that would all happen at the time that the temple was destroyed. And so the idea is that Jesus himself thought and taught that the world would end right on the heels of the destruction of Jerusalem, and that he was just wrong, that he got his prediction wrong, that Jesus himself taught error. And of course, we reject that out of hand as a matter of faith. This error is most commonly found in academic circles. You're not going to find this in a whole lot of churches, although you will find this among some pastors, ministers, people who have received formal training in theology. Now, the chief cause of all of these difficulties is that Jesus talks about both judgments in this discourse. And we can demonstrate that pretty easily just with a couple of passages taken from this discourse. So first, I want us to demonstrate that not all of this discourse pertains to the final judgment, that some of it has an historical fulfillment. We can, first off, consider the subject of the discourse from the first 3 verses of it. All right, go to chapter 24. We'll read the first 3 verses. Jesus left the temple and was going away when his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. But he answered them, "You see all these, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." As he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us when these things will be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" All right, when Jesus begins this discourse, he is explicitly answering these questions about the destruction of the temple, an event that happened in history. Again, in verse 15, "So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place," let the reader understand, "then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down to take what is in his house. And let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas, for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days, pray that your flight may not be in winter or on a Sabbath." I want us to consider that that passage does not fit into the scheme of the final judgment. Because elsewhere, Paul tells us, how quickly will the Lord's coming happen? Okay, well, it'll come like a thief in the night. That's the surprise element. But how quickly will it happen? The twinkling of an eye. it does not make any sense for Jesus, if he's talking about that final judgment that is going to take place in the twinkling of an eye, it does not make sense for him to say, let the one who's, all those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. What good is that going to do you? When the Lord comes back, it doesn't matter if you're on the plains or on the mountaintop, if you're on the housetop, if you're in your house getting your stuff, if you're in the field, if you're getting your cloak. It doesn't matter if you're pregnant or nursing. If the final judgment has come upon you, it's like that. These warnings would be nonsensical. You're not going to run from the final judgment. You will, however, run from an historical judgment, which we'll talk about a little later on. Let's see. The real nail in the coffin to this, I think, is verse 34, which repeats, and this is why I said it's important for us to keep Matthew 23 in mind as we're studying this, because Jesus says the same thing in Matthew 23, but in Matthew 24, verse 34, he says, "Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place." The judgment that he's been talking about up to this point is a judgment that will befall those people who are listening to him.
40-year period?
Roughly speaking, yeah. Yeah, because if we take Jesus being crucified roughly AD 33, temple being destroyed in 70, the signs, and we're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit, the temple was destroyed in 70, but the Roman invasion of Palestine began several years earlier. And those are some of the signs that Jesus is pointing to. We always attribute the destruction of the temple to the general Titus, but it was actually his father, Vespasian, who did most of the invading work. He was the general who led 4 legions of Romans into Palestine, took control of all the surrounding region, and then besieged Jerusalem. And it was only at that point that Vespasian ended up going back to Rome to take his seat as emperor and left his son in charge of finishing what he started. But this was a multi-year-long endeavor that the Romans went on. In other words, it's the kind of thing that you could see unfolding and also the kind of thing that you could run from. But it would have been also the sort of thing that most of the people who would have been listening to this at the time would have been around for. Wayne?
Just small, no matter. Their strategy a lot of times in order to take a large city, and that still as is today, is to surround it and starve it out.
Yep.
And that's what happened over and over and over again. It wasn't just Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. It was all over Israel.
Yeah. And that's, we mentioned Josephus on occasion. He was a Jewish historian who was a contemporary of Jesus and who lived through some of these events that we're talking about. And one of the ways that he survived through all of that was he basically sold out the other guys who were with him in I forget the name of the place where he was holed up, where they were besieged. But yeah, Rome went around doing this to lots of different places. There were lots of different pockets of resistance, and the Romans just snuffed them out one by one. Very few people escaped from it. Again, confirming everything that we're about to read in Matthew 24. So, clearly, for some portion of this discourse, Jesus is speaking of an historical judgment, not the end of the world, but a judgment that occurred in this world. But next, let us also, well, actually, before we continue, any questions or comments about that?
I just wanted to ask a
Sure.
question.
Sure thing.
This is the NLT translation.
Uh-huh.
The day is coming when you will see what Daniel the prophet spoke about, the sacrilegious object that causes desecration standing in the holy place.
Yes. Yeah, in verse 15. Okay. So what's the question?
What
What is it? Okay.
is some sort of vital or?
So there is some disagreement about this. Yeah, some people interpret this as the destruction of the temple itself, but I don't think it fits what Jesus is saying here, because it's when you see this thing, that is your cue to flee. And by the time that the Romans are destroying the temple, it's too late. Everything is done. Like that is the end of their conquest of Palestine. It might have been our brother Kenny Chumbley, I forget. I want to say it was in his commentary. He suggested that what Jesus is referring to here by the holy place is not the temple itself, but the Holy Land, and that the abomination that makes desolate, the abomination that destroys, is these Roman legions entering into the Holy Land. That makes better sense, I think. That's a good question. Wayne, do you have one?
I was going to contradict you. I'm sorry, but
Go for it.
No, but maybe I've gotten my dates wrong. But I always thought and was taught that the Romans, after they got through with Jerusalem, they went after the Zealots down in Masada, and they went to the Essenes off into the desert regions. They were into a stone city they carved inside of a stone, a rock, and they went in there and slaughtered them. There were several battles after that, but yeah, the culmination. That's what brought Israel down. I mean, that destroyed the nation Israel, because that was where it was centered around, was the temple.
Right, yeah.
And take the temple
that's the
out,
locus of who
there
they
is no
are.
more Israel.
Yeah. Yeah. And after that point, Israel is kind of hanging on, like in name only, until the Romans come back in 135 and just completely finish it, deport everybody. And that's the point at which the Jewish people basically become scattered, like completely. Yeah. So that's when we really start talking about the diaspora, and that's what carries on down to the modern day even. Okay. So next, I want us to demonstrate that not all of this discourse pertains to that historical judgment, that some part of it does deal with the last day, with the final judgment. There are a few directions that we could go with this, but I think the real definitive proof begins in Matthew 25, verse 31, where Jesus describes this famous scene of judgment separating the sheep and the goats. And by the way, we should note that this is a separate description of judgment. He's given us a description of judgment in Matthew 24 already, and then we get these three parables in the middle, and then we get another description of judgment in Matthew 25. But in this other description of judgment, we read things that, well, let me frame it this way. Everyone, and I mean everyone in the churches of Christ, recognizes Matthew 25, 31 through 46 as a description pertaining to the final judgment. I have never, ever heard anybody, whether we're talking churches of Christ or anyone else, characterize this, apart from preterists, I mean, characterize this as an historical judgment, and for good reason. You look in verse 41. Then he will say to those on his left, "Depart from me, you cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels." That's not an historical judgment. That's last judgment. Or again, verse 46. These will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life. That is not a description of historical judgment. nor can it be twisted to fit a merely historical judgment. We're talking about eternal life. That's not something that has happened historically. That is something that awaits the last judgment. And Paul talks about it in 1 Thessalonians, 2 Thessalonians. We'll touch on some of those passages as we continue through this study. But if we understand that Jesus is speaking of two different judgments, which are two different kinds of judgment, well, then where do we separate one discussion from the other? And it's hard to pin down a precise place where this change occurs. I think probably the most natural transition occurs over verses 36 through 44, which I think concludes Jesus' thoughts about the destruction of the temple. But then we get a set of three parables running from Matthew 24:45 through Matthew 25:30. And we always interpret these parables individually to be parables concerning the final judgment, like the parable of the talents, or the parable of the wise and foolish virgins. We always teach those as pertaining to the final judgment. Now, over the course of that whole section, from verse Matthew 24:36 through Matthew 25:30, we find a unified message calling for vigilance, calling for diligence. Be ready all the time. And that's something that's shared in common whether we're considering the judgments of this world or the final judgment at the end of all things. Right? If we're talking about somebody living in Judea, a disciple of Jesus living in Judea during that first century, they need to be on guard and ready for the judgment that is going to befall Judea. They also need to be ready, like all of us do, need to be ready and on guard because we don't know when the Lord will come back and the final judgment will occur. So, and it's over the course of that teaching that Jesus transitions from considering that historical judgment to considering the final judgment. If we had to draw a hard and fast line, it probably occurs between 24:44 and 24:45. But I suspect that the reason that Jesus structures this discourse in the way that he does is he's setting these two judgments side by side. And showing us that the historical judgments, like all historical judgments in the Scriptures, foreshadow the final judgment. Right? And that's true of any judgment we read of in the Scriptures. You go back to any of the historical judgments that happened against Israel, like in the book of Judges, all of those can be preached as foreshadowings, spiritual allegories concerning the last judgment. Right, that if God punishes the wicked and spares the righteous even in this world, well, how much more so in the life to come? If diligence is needed in the here and now, well, how much more so? How much more diligent ought we to be concerning the life to come? All right, so that is all the groundwork that I want to lay for getting us into this discourse. Let's go ahead and read the first 14 verses of Matthew 24, and we'll get into the text proper. And hopefully all of this groundwork will pay off and will be borne out in what we study together here. All right, Matthew 24, verse 1. Jesus left the temple and was going away when his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. But he answered them, "You see all these, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." As he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" And Jesus answered them, "See that no one leads you astray. For many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Christ,' and they will lead many astray. and you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are but the beginning of the birth pangs. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another. And many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. And because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations. And then the end will come. All right, so this whole discourse, like we said earlier, is a response to 2 or 3 questions from the disciples. And it starts with this, it's almost offhanded exchange between the disciples and Jesus in the first 2 verses. The disciples are impressed by the grandeur of Herod's temple. And based on all the contemporary descriptions that we have of it, we really can't blame them. Like, these are really impressive buildings. We were talking before Bible class started about some mega church campuses and how just ornate and lavishly built they are. Those are the McMansions of the temple world. The temple that Herod built was truly spectacular. I think we mentioned this on Sunday, but one common description of it is that you could see it glittering in the sun from miles away. Like, you knew when you were approaching Jerusalem because the temple is on the mountain. It's on the high point. Everything around you're approaching, you're looking up. That is the monument, the landmark, wherever you're coming from in that area. And all of the gold and the white stone that was used in its construction, it's like seeing a star in the middle of the day sitting up on top of this hill. And so, honestly, I think you and I would probably have the same reaction. It's kind of like if you've ever hung out at the like any of the Smithsonian buildings in Washington. Like, this is really, really cool. Jesus, in response to this, just casually drops a bomb on the disciples. Oh, you see all this? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. All right, that is quite a statement, and the disciples understandably would like Jesus to elaborate on it. Right? It would be like going to New York in the 90s or the 80s and telling some New Yorker, oh yeah, you see these towers here? They're going to be completely down in the ground. There's going to be nothing left of them. What do you mean by that? So after they have all stopped on the Mount of Olives, the disciples ask him, tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? And this is where the trouble begins, because there's at least 2 questions here. But some, like our brother Kenny Chumbley, discern 3 questions in this. The first question, when will these things be? And that's clearly referring back to what Jesus has just told them, that there's not going to be, that the temple is going to be completely ripped down. When's that going to happen? Now, if we split this into 3 questions, well, then the second question is, what will be the sign of your coming? And the third question would be, what will be the sign of the end of the age? Now, I suspect that the disciples are asking this just as 2 questions. When will these things be? And, what is the sign of your coming and the end of the age? They understand his coming and the end of the age to be one event. And they want to know, what's the sign that that's going to happen? But this is where we have to begin to confront our ignorance of the disciples' precise understanding of things. Because in Matthew's account, they seem to have accepted that Jesus will die and be raised, but we're left wondering, well, how well do they understand that? Do they understand that the crucifixion and the resurrection are going to mark a transition from the prior age into a new age? And how well do they understand the second coming? Do they think of it as being related to the destruction of the temple and the end of the age? In other words, are they confusing all of these things together as like one big event? We don't know. We have to plead ignorance on all of these things because Matthew wants us to focus on Jesus' response to these questions. And he begins by addressing that first question: when will the temple be destroyed? And he will address that not only in terms of when, but also in terms of signs. Right, what are the signs that the destruction of the temple is imminent? And that's the content of this first passage that we've just read. He starts to get at what the sign is by talking first about what the sign is not. Here are a lot of things that are going to happen ahead of the destruction of the temple, but these things do not themselves signify the destruction of the temple. Right? That includes wars and rumors of wars, nation rising against nation, kingdom against kingdom. It includes famines and earthquakes. It includes a great persecution and a great apostasy that includes falling away and false prophecy, false teaching, betrayal, love growing cold. And it also includes the gospel being proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations. Jesus says all of this stuff is going to happen. It's going to happen before every stone is torn down from this temple. But these things happening do not themselves signify that the temple is about to be torn down. In other words, when you see this stuff going on, don't think, okay, it's panic time. Time to head for the hills. The temple's about to be destroyed. Now, these are all things that we can find in the New Testament as part of the early church's experience. In fact, the greater part of the epistles deal with the continual crises of faith in the early churches and the ever-present threat of apostasy. Think of the book of Hebrews, for example. The big problem there is that all of these Jewish Christians are thinking about just giving up on Jesus. They're thinking about walking away from the faith, thinking about apostasy. Or consider how often in the epistles there are warnings about false teachers and false prophets. We've got those in the epistles of Paul, Peter, John, and Jude. Everybody who wrote epistles in the New Testament included warnings about false teachers and false prophets. All of them do. And there are warnings about false Christs as well. Go to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. I'm going to read the first two verses there. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. And by the way, this passage is, I think, evidence that even the early church struggled in understanding what all of these prophecies pertained to. They had a lot of anxiety about the end of the world. And one of the things that we read in 2 Thessalonians 2, now concerning the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and our being gathered together to him, we ask you, brothers, not to be quickly shaken in mind or alarmed, either by a spirit or a spoken word or a letter seeming to come from us to the effect that the day of the Lord has come. Right, this is very similar. Paul frames this very similarly to the way that Jesus frames it. See that no one leads you astray. Right, they're both calling for keeping your head. Right, keep cool. Many will come in my name saying, I am the Christ. They'll lead many astray. And apparently, there are some in Thessalonica who suspect that the Christ has already come, that the second coming has happened. They are proto-preterists in a way. On top of that, we also in the New Testament find lots and lots of descriptions of persecution. The book of Acts, it describes the early church in the midst, really, of all of these things that Jesus prophesied about in Matthew 24. Consider Acts 11, verse 28. One of them, named Agabus, stood up and foretold by the Spirit that there would be a great famine over all the world. And this took place in the days of Claudius. All right, there's an historical famine right there. Is it time to freak out? No, that's the point of what Jesus is saying. This famine is going to happen, but it's not time yet. This will happen before the end, but it doesn't signify the end. Or in Acts 17, remember let's see, if I remember right, this was Paul in Thessalonica. It's an example of persecution going on. In Acts 17, verse 6, we read, when they could not find them, they dragged Jason and some of the brothers before the city authorities, shouting, "These men who have turned the world upside down have come here also." Or again in Matthew 24, verse 5, some of the lawyers accusing Paul, "We have found this man a plague, one who stirs up riots among all the Jews throughout the whole world, and is a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes." And so in both of these passages, Luke shows us persecution going on, but also unbelievers expressing the idea that the message of Jesus Christ has spread across the world, that the world is familiar with what Paul is preaching. And Paul himself speaks this way. In Colossians 1 and verse 6, Paul speaks of the gospel, which has come to you, as indeed in the whole world it is bearing fruit and increasing, as it does also among you, since the day you heard it and understood the grace of God in truth. Go ahead, Wayne. No, say Romans 16?
Yeah. Verse,
Just about as
Romans 16, verse 25, starting, "Now to him that is able to strengthen you according to my gospel and the preaching of Jesus Christ, according to the revelation of a mystery that was kept secret for long ages, has now been disclosed, and through the prophetic writings has been made known to all nations."
Yes.
"And according to the command of the eternal God, to bring about the obedience of faith to the only wise God, be glory forever through Jesus Christ." Amen.
Yeah, there we go. And I was going to read another example in Colossians 1:23 as well, but it just speaks to the same effect. That in other words, by their estimation, again, this is well ahead of the destruction of the temple, the gospel has spread all over the earth. And in using this phrase, it's like when we say, you can find a McDonald's anywhere in the world. Right? Well, what if I go to some undiscovered tribe, some Pacific Islanders or something? Oh, there's not a McDonald's here. You're lying. I can't find them anywhere in the world. It's, okay, come on now. You know what we mean whenever we say you can find McDonald's anywhere in the world. That's kind of the sense in which we're talking about the gospel being spread across the whole world. That the gospel has gone out from Judea and Samaria, has gone among the Greek peoples, has gone among the Roman peoples, and is spread all over the empire. And from that point, like when you've got the Roman Empire covered, it's just radiating out from there. All right, so all of these things that Jesus talks about in these first 14 verses are things that happened before the destruction of the temple in AD 70. All right, so we're only partway through our case here in understanding the judgment of Matthew 24. Lord willing, we will continue on Sunday with some of these specific signs that he talks about beginning in verse 15. So thank you so much for your kind attention and your questions and comments this evening.